What do you do when God gives you everything and then asks for it back? That's not a metaphor. That's the story of Abraham, a man who waited his entire life for one promise, just one. A child, an heir, a son to carry the legacy of a covenant made beneath the stars. A child who would represent not only hope, but the faithfulness of God himself. And then, one day, after years of longing, failing, trying to force God's plan through human hands, Isaac was born. Laughter filled the tent. A miracle cried out in the arms of a woman once barren. The silence of Sarah's womb was broken, and the sound of a new beginning echoed through the camp. Isaac, his name means laughter. Not the laughter of doubt, but of joy, of redemption, of the impossible made flesh. Abraham loved this boy. He held him close. He taught him how to build altars, how to gather wood, how to lift his eyes to the hills and know that help comes from the Lord. This was more than a son. This was a living prophecy. Every time Isaac laughed, it was a reminder God keeps his promises. And then came the unthinkable. Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt, burnt offering. Pause. That's not just instruction. That's devastation in a single sentence. God doesn't just say your son. He says your only son, the one you love, the one you waited for, the one you nearly gave up on. That's the one I want you to place on the altar. That's the one I want you to let go of. What kind of God would ask that? And what kind of man would obey? The next morning, Abraham rises. No argument, no delay. Just obedience, silent, steady, and heartbreaking. He saddles the donkey, splits the wood, calls Isaac and 2 servants, and begins the journey. 3 days. 3 days of walking with the weight of a decision no father should ever have to make. 3 days of staring at the boy beside him and knowing what's coming. 3 days of silence, screaming louder than words. And then Moriah. Abraham turns to the servants and says, "Stay here. We will worship, and we will come back." Did you catch that? We will come back. Faith was still alive. Somehow, some way, Abraham believed that even if Isaac died, God could raise him, because God had made a promise, and Abraham had come too far to turn back now. He lays the wood on Isaac's back, just like another son generations later would carry his own wood up a hill. Isaac walks beside him, unaware, yet obedient. Father Isaac asks, "We have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb?" And Abraham replies with trembling lips, God will provide for himself the lamb. God will provide. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who sees, the Lord who provides. They reach the top. Abraham builds the altar, stone by stone, wood placed carefully. And then he binds his son. This isn't a toddler. Isaac is old enough to resist, but he doesn't. He lays down, silent, trusting, just like Abraham once trusted the voice that told him to leave everything behind. Now his son trusts the same voice. And Abraham lifts the knife. Pause again. Imagine the world holding its breath, angels watching in stunned silence, heaven tense, the heart of a father breaking, the heart of a son trusting, the knife raised high, glinting in the sun, and then a voice. "Abraham, Abraham." He stops, knife frozen midair, breath caught in his chest. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in the thicket. God provides, he always does. Abraham takes the ram and offers it in Isaac's place. The altar still burns, but now with mercy. The knife still falls, but not on the son. The substitute takes the place of the promised, and a shadow of Calvary is cast over Moriah. Because this story wasn't just about Abraham or Isaac. It was about the heart of God. You see, one day, God would do what he stopped Abraham from doing. He would offer his only son, the one he loved, the one he promised. And this time there would be no voice from heaven to stop the nails. No ram in the thicket, no last-minute rescue. Just blood, just wood, just the weight of sin on the back of a spotless lamb. But that's the end of the story. For now we stand with Abraham on the mountain of obedience, with a knife in one hand and trembling faith in the other. Because there are moments in every believer's life when God will ask, "Do you trust me?" Even with the thing you love most, it won't always be your child. Sometimes it's your calling, your identity, your reputation, your dream, your future. And God will whisper, "Lay it down," not because He wants to destroy it, but because He wants to see your heart. True faith doesn't just receive, it releases. Real worship isn't about music, it's about sacrifice. And the greatest act of faith is not just believing God will give, but believing He is good, even if He takes away. So the question is, what's your Isaac? What's the thing God gave you and now asks you to trust Him with? Because the mountain still stands, the altar still burns, the knife still rises, and the voice of the Lord still calls. Will you obey? Will you trust? Will you believe that even if you lay it down, God will provide? Imagine being Isaac. You're walking with your father, the man you've trusted your whole life. You've seen the way he prays. You've heard the stories of how God spoke to him, how angels visited him, how promises were made beneath starlit skies. You've watched him build altars before, offer sacrifices, speak blessings. This isn't a man given to fantasy. He's a man of faith, a man of obedience. So when he calls your name that morning and says, "Come, we're going to worship you, follow Rotuel." Not you carry the wood just like always. You climb the mountain just like before. But something's different this time. There's no lamb. You ask, of course, because something inside you knows worship requires sacrifice. And without a lamb, what are we offering? God will provide, he says, and that should settle it. But it doesn't, because when you reach the top, he begins to build the altar, and still no lamb appears. He stacks the wood in a familiar shape. He lays out the firestones. The knife glints at his side, and then he turns to you not with fury, not with manipulation, but with tears in his eyes and trembling in his hands. "Isaac," he says softly, and suddenly everything clicks. The lamb is you, but here's the miracle. You don't run. You could. You're strong, young, fast. He's old, weakened, weathered, and yet you stay. You lie down. You let him bind your hands. You let him lift the knife. Why? Because faith doesn't just live in Abraham, it lives in Isaac too. This is the part we rarely talk about. We often highlight Abraham's obedience, but we forget Isaac's surrender. This young man who had every reason to fight, to flee, to resist, lays his life on the altar. Willingly. He doesn't know what God will do. He doesn't have the voice of the Lord ringing in his ears. He only has the trust he's built from watching his father walk with God. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the strength of your faith is measured by your silence and surrender. This moment on Mount Moriah wasn't just a test for Abraham. It was a shaping of Isaac. It was a divine chisel carving identity into the heart of a chosen son. Because one day, Isaac would become a father too. One day, he would carry the promise forward. And he needed to know that obedience sometimes hurts, that faith sometimes bleeds, that worship often feels like death, before it ever feels like resurrection. Isaac laid down not just his body, but his will, his right to choose, his desire for safety. And in doing so, he became more than a son. He became a picture, a foreshadow, a glimpse into the future when another son would climb another hill, carrying wood on his back, not for worship, but for execution. Mount Moriah whispers of Mount Calvary. Isaac prefigures Jesus. Both were promised sons. Both were born miraculously. Both carried wood up a hill. Both were accompanied by their father. Both laid down willingly. And both trusted the one who holds the knife. But where Isaac was spared, Jesus was not. That's what makes the cross even more powerful. God didn't just ask Abraham to do something he was unwilling to do, he walked the road all the way. When the time came for sacrifice, heaven did not withhold the blade. The Father did not call out to stop the hammer. There was no ram caught in the thicket. The Lamb of God was slain. For you, for me, for Isaac. For every heart that's ever beat with rebellion and shame and fear and sin. And this changes everything. Because now we're not just called to admire Isaac's surrender, we're called to imitate it. We're called to lay down our lives not once in a dramatic moment, but daily. We're invited to place our dreams, our desires, our relationships, our fears, our ambitions on the altar. To trust that even if God asks for what we love most, it's not to destroy us, but to shape us, to refine us, to show us that what He gives, He sustains, and what He takes, He redeems. Isaac walked down that mountain different, not because he had scars on his skin, but because something shifted in his soul. He had met the altar, he had tasted surrender, he had witnessed firsthand the knife stop inches from his throat. Not because he was righteous, but because mercy spoke. And I wonder, how many of us are still fighting the altar? How many of us are clutching the wood, but refusing to lie down? How many of us trust God with our eternity, but not with our today? We say, "Take my sin," but we hide our schedule. We say, "Take my heart," but we grip our relationships. We say, "Use me," but we don't surrender control. But here's the thing, God isn't after your performance. He's after your permission. He doesn't want your perfection. He wants your presence. The altar isn't a place of punishment. It's a place of meeting. It's where God provides. It's where fear dies and faith is born. It's where surrender becomes strength. And it's where we remember that the Lamb has already taken our place. Isaac didn't die that day, but something inside him did. Self-reliance, fear, the illusion of control, and what rose in its place was stronger faith, legacy, identity, and the same can be true for you. But you have to climb the hill. You have to build the altar. You have to lie down and trust that the God who called you here isn't finished writing your story. Because sometimes the greatest miracles don't happen before the altar, but after it. The question is, will you get on? Will you trust like Isaac? Will you surrender like the son? Will you believe that even in the silence, even with the knife raised, even when the fire is set, God will provide? Centuries would pass. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Empires would wage war. Prophets would weep and priests would plead. And still the world waited for the promise to be fulfilled. But Moriah remained. The mountain where Abraham built an altar didn't disappear into history. It became a stage, a sacred platform set by the hand of God. Because Moriah wasn't just a location. It was a prophecy made of stone and shadow. Generations after Abraham and Isaac, a king would rise. David, a shepherd boy turned warrior, a poet with blood on his hands, but a heart after God. And in the days of David, Moriah would reappear. It was there, on that same mountain ridge, that David would see the angel of judgment standing over Jerusalem, and in repentance he would build an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah. It was the very same place Abraham once raised his knife, the very same place Isaac once laid down. But the story wasn't over. David's son Solomon would be the one to build the temple on that mountain, the temple where sacrifices were made, blood was shed. Sins were symbolically carried away by lambs that could never truly cleanse. Year after year, the fire never stopped burning. Morning and evening, the priests lifted knives and poured blood shadows of something greater. Still, Moriah waited. And then came Jesus, born of a virgin, raised in a carpenter's home, full of grace and truth. He healed the sick, loved the unlovable, silenced storms, and wept with the broken. But that wasn't his mission. That wasn't the final altar. One day he climbed a hill. It wasn't called Moriah anymore. By then it was known as Golgotha, the place of the skull. But it stood on the same ridge. The same ground that once felt the fire of Abraham's obedience would now feel the weight of God's love made flesh. Jesus carried his own wood, just like Isaac. He was accompanied by two others, just like Abraham and the servants. And when he reached the top, he wasn't rescued. There was no ram in the thicket, because this time God wasn't stopping the knife. This time, he was holding it. The Father poured out the wrath of judgment not on sinners, but on the sinless one. The Lamb who takes away the sin of the world hung suspended between heaven and earth, bleeding mercy into every broken corner of the human story. And as he cried, "It is finished," the veil in the temple tore from top to bottom, as if heaven itself, Kazuya, couldn't wait to open access again. And it all traces back to Moriah. The story of Isaac was never just about a test. It was about a blueprint, a prophetic rehearsal for a redemption that would one day include all of us. So what does that mean for you? It means that when God asks for your Isaac, he's not playing games. He's inviting you into the same legacy of faith that rewrote history. He's not trying to hurt you. He's preparing to reveal himself in a way you've never seen before, because every altar leads to an encounter. Abraham met the God who provides. Isaac met the God who preserves. And you're invited to meet the God who sacrificed for you. But that's not all. It also means this. The cross was never plan B. Jesus was always the Lamb. Revelation calls him the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. In other words, before God said, "Let there be light," he had already said, "Let there be blood." It's not because he delights in pain, but because he knew the cost of love. True love always includes sacrifice, and salvation would never come cheaply. So yes, Moriah was bloody. It was terrifying. It was the scene of a father unholding a knife above his son. But that knife never fell. Not because God changed his mind, but because he already had a better lamb in mind. Jesus, he is the better Isaac, the better sacrifice, the fulfillment of every altar ever built and every lamb ever slain. And because of him, we don't just admire the story of Abraham and Isaac, we step into it. We become the ones who carry wood, who climb hills, who face hard decisions and whispered doubts and impossible tests, and we do it with one truth burning in our bones: God will provide. Not always the way we expect, not always when we want, but always in a way that brings him glory and draws us closer. Maybe right now you're on your own Mount Moriah. You've laid something down, or maybe God's asking you to. Maybe it's a relationship, a dream, a career, a calling. Maybe it's your pride, your safety, your reputation, and the knife is trembling in your hand. You want to trust, but the fire is real. The wood is heavy, and silence feels like abandonment. But listen, the God who spoke to Abraham still speaks. The God who provided a ram still provides. The God who spared Isaac didn't forget you. He hasn't abandoned you. He's not done writing your story. Because Moriah wasn't the end for Isaac. It was the beginning. It was the moment his faith became his own. The day he learned that surrender leads to revelation. That sometimes you have to lie down to rise up. That the altar doesn't mean death, it means transformation. And for you, the altar is still open. Not one built of stone and wood, but of heart and surrender. Not on a mountain in the Middle East, but in the secret place of obedience. Right where you are. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to say yes. Yes to the climb. Yes to the fire. Yes to the God who sometimes tests but always provides. Because here's the secret: the altar isn't where we lose, it's where we find. It's where we meet the God who gave us everything and gave us back more than we ever expected. So build the altar, climb the mountain, lay it down, and watch what God does next. The lamb is already in the thicket. The cross has already been raised. The price has already been paid. All that's left is your yes.